My mother-in-law tried to drug me during her own birthday dinner. What she didn't know was I had a camera on the entire time, and by the end of that night I had everything I needed to destroy the lies her family spent years protecting. They say you can feel it when something's wrong, like the pressure change before a storm, or the weight of a stare that's just a little too long. I felt it the second Diane turned and saw me standing in the kitchen. "Oh, Julian," she said too brightly. "You startled me." She was holding 2 wine glasses, sangria, she claimed, dessert drinks for her birthday dinner. But one of those glasses wasn't like the others. I'd seen it a second earlier before she noticed me, her hand unscrewing a small, clear vial, tipping it carefully into one of the glasses. It mixed fast, colorless, odorless, but not invisible. I saw the faint shimmer, the oily film that caught the overhead light. "Special cocktail for my favorite son-in-law," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I forced a smile of my own. "Thanks, Diane. Let me help you carry these." Reached for both glasses before she could protest. Her hesitation was microscopic, a blink too long, a hitch in her breath. But I caught it. She released them. In the dining room, the rest of the family chatted without urgency. Gerald, my father-in-law, was checking his phone as usual. Haley's brother Owen was in the middle of a story about a fishing trip that none of us really cared about. My wife Haley was laughing politely, her hand resting on my shoulder as I approached. "Sangria, sir," I said, placing the tampered glass in front of Gerald with a small nod. I handed the untouched one to Diane, who had taken her seat at the head of the table. "I'm good with water," I said when she looked at me, holding out the final glass. Diane's eyes flicked from the drink to me. "You sure?" "Positive. I'm still dehydrated from the trip. Montana's air is dry this time of year." She said nothing, just nodded and turned away. I sipped my water slowly, waited. The minutes passed like a countdown. Gerald took several, large sips of his drink between bites of chocolate cake, commenting about real estate prices in Asheville and how the market was about to flip. I nodded occasionally, pretending to listen. Diane barely touched hers. I don't think she could. 45 minutes later, Gerald went pale. It started with a hand to his forehead, a long exhale. Then came the sweating. He loosened his collar, muttered something about the shrimp tasting off, and excused himself. We all heard it. The sounds coming from the bathroom down the hall weren't subtle. Diane stood slowly, her napkin still neatly folded in her lap. Haley called out to her dad, concern in her voice. Diane said something about bad shellfish, the wine mixing badly, anything but the truth. But she wasn't looking at Gerald. She was looking at me. Her eyes locked onto mine, wide, calculating. There was no confusion in them, no panic, no guilt. Just the chilling awareness that I knew what she had done, and that it hadn't worked. I didn't flinch, didn't raise my voice or accuse her. I just stared back, calm and unreadable. Then I turned back to my dessert and took another bite, chocolate cake with raspberry drizzle. A little dry, but it hit the spot. Haley left the table to check on her dad. Diane hesitated a beat too long before following. Owen and Vanessa sat there, half stunned, unsure what to do. I leaned back in my chair, letting the sounds of chaos drift down the hall. Inside, I felt cold, not angry, not shocked. Cold, like something inside me had snapped and refrozen into something sharper, because in that moment, I realized I'd spent 6 years trying to be part of this family, showing up to dinners, laughing at Gerald's smug jokes, nodding, through Diane's polite condescension. I'd done it all for Haley, because I knew how much she wanted me to be accepted, to be loved, but they never would. That was the moment I stopped trying to be accepted, and started preparing for war. Met Haley at a gallery in downtown Asheville 6 years ago. I had a few prints hanging in a collective exhibition, landscape shots from Patagonia, some candid street work from New Orleans. Nothing revolutionary, but enough to catch her eye. She was finishing her master's in environmental science and wandered in with a friend between classes. She stood in front of one of my pieces for longer than anyone else did that night. It was a photo of a heron mid-flight, wings frozen against a foggy lake. I remember watching her tilt her head, the way she leaned forward slightly like she was trying to step inside the frame. When I approached and told her I'd taken it, she just said, "Of course you did," like it was obvious. We had coffee the next day. The rest happened fast. It was easy with Haley, effortless. She never asked me what my backup plan was. She never told me to get real. She just believed I'd make it work, and I did. But marrying someone doesn't mean you marry their parents' values. And with the Renners, those values were carved in stone. From day one, Gerald made his expectations clear. Investment banker, Princeton alum, fluent in golf and passive aggression. He didn't ask what I did. He asked when I was going to get serious. The first time we had dinner at their house, he handed me his card and said, "If you ever decide you want to build a future instead of just capturing the past, give me a call." Diane was worse because she was quieter, polished, well-read, always smiling, and always reminding me subtly that I didn't fit. At our engagement dinner, she introduced me to her friends as Julian the photographer, like I was a novelty act. Over the years, she'd ask about my projects the way someone might ask a child about finger painting. Every time I told her about a new client or a magazine spread, she'd find a way to pivot the conversation to someone she knew who really made something of themselves. They didn't see what I did as real work. It wasn't secure, it wasn't scalable. It wasn't in their minds enough for their daughter. Still, I kept showing up. I brought expensive wine to family dinners. I offered to take their Christmas photos. I volunteered to help fix their old digital frame when it broke. I even printed a framed photo of the lake house they loved for their anniversary one year. It ended up in the guest bathroom, but I didn't complain. Haley loved them, blind spots and all. And I loved Haley. So I learned to keep the peace. Nodded politely when Gerald made digs about freelancing versus having a career. I smiled through Diane's backhanded compliments. I laughed at stories I'd already heard 10 times. Every time I told Haley about a success, National Geographic, Vanity Fair, even a TEDx feature, she'd light up. And then, almost immediately, I'd watch her dim just slightly when she remembered that her parents would find a way to dismiss it. Still, she squeezed my hand under the table. She whispered, "I'm proud of you," after every dinner. And I held on to that. But things started changing after our wedding. The comments got sharper. Gerald asked about our financial plans in front of extended family. Diane made offhand remarks about creative phases and how some people grow out of them. I overheard her once on the phone saying, "Haley could have married Thomas, you know, family money, medical degree, but she went with the artist." The way she said artist made it sound like a disease. I asked Haley once gently why she thought her mom held on to Thomas so tightly. She hesitated, then said, "Because he reminded her of my dad, and because he was easy to control." I should have picked up on that last part sooner, but I still thought time would change things, that eventually I'd wear them down with consistency, with success, with proof that I wasn't going anywhere. I didn't realize that people like Diane and Gerald don't warm up to you. They wait for you to fail so they can say they were right all along. And if you don't fail on your own, well, they give you a little push. We'd been married 4 years when Haley and I started talking about having a baby. It wasn't some dramatic let's build a family moment. Just 2 cups of tea on a quiet Sunday morning, both of us curled under a shared blanket and her saying, "I think I'm ready if you are." I said yes without hesitation. I meant it. I still do. She told her parents that night. Gerald's reaction was immediate. He smiled too wide, clapped me on the back like I'd just bought my first stock, and poured himself a drink. But later, as we were saying our goodbyes, he asked me to step outside with him for a quick word. Stood near their front porch beneath a motion sensor light that buzzed faintly. "Children are expensive, Julian," he said. "And unpredictable. It's a lot of pressure. You might want to consider something more stable, just until things settle." "I've been covering our bills and savings for years," I replied. He nodded, but not like he believed me. More like he was humoring me. A good man provides security, not just creativity, he said, straightening his collar. Think about that before you bring someone else into the world. I clenched my jaw but said nothing, just stared back until he looked away. The next day, I booked a double shoot, one for a local environmental nonprofit, the other for a luxury furniture brand. Both clients found me through word of mouth, the kind of work that paid well and meant something. I didn't do it to prove anything. I did it because I needed to keep moving, to stay grounded. But the weight of Gerald's words lingered longer than I expected. That same week, I overheard Diane on the phone with her friend Elise. She wasn't trying to be quiet, just assumed I wasn't in earshot while grabbing my jacket from the coat closet. No, not yet, she was saying. They're trying. I just worry about Haley, you know. She needs someone steady. She had that with Thomas, but she chose Julian. Creative people, they don't think long-term. A pause. Yes, the photographer. Still doing it full-time, I know. She laughed then, soft but cutting. That night, I didn't tell Haley. I told myself it wasn't the right moment, that I didn't want to put her in a position where she felt she had to defend me, or worse, question whether she should. The truth? I didn't want to see her look at me the way her parents did, even for a second. It wasn't just the things they said. It was the way they said them, the pauses, the looks. They were just concerned tone that made you feel like a child who hadn't done his homework. The more I thought about it, the more it started making sense. Thomas, the orthopedic surgeon. I'd heard about him in passing, always coded in regret. Gerald once mentioned him during dinner. That boy had a good head on his shoulders. Diane kept a photo of him and Haley from college in one of the hallway albums. I didn't take it personally back then. People have pasts, but now it felt like more than nostalgia. It felt like a comparison I was constantly losing. I started asking quiet questions. Haley's college roommate, Bethany, mentioned once that Thomas and Haley had been engaged for a few months. I hadn't known that. Bethany said he'd ended it, but then quickly corrected herself. It was mutual, but messy. Haley never talked about it. Still, I didn't push, but I started wondering, how much of that mess had Diane's fingerprints on it? The pattern was there if you looked close enough. Haley's ex-friends, the ones who were too intense, too independent, or not the right influence. The professors she stopped emailing. The job opportunities she passed up because family comes first. It wasn't just me they disapproved of. It was anyone who made Haley think for herself. The thing is, Haley is smart, sharp, empathetic. But she grew up in a house where love was earned through compliance, where approval was conditional, and she didn't even know it. So I kept quiet, kept taking the high road, kept letting them walk all over me if it meant Haley could keep believing they were just a little old-fashioned, a little too protective. Not toxic, not dangerous, but I wasn't naive. I knew people like Diane and Gerald didn't get more subtle with time. They just got better at hiding their knives. So I watched. I waited. I kept receipts. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I was done being caught off guard. The morning after the dinner, I slipped the untouched glass into a padded lens case and sealed it in a Ziploc. I didn't have a plan yet, just instinct. Something inside. He told me this couldn't be brushed off, not this time. Jason owed me a favor. He was a former client, ran a private toxicology lab that handled high-end legal disputes and corporate misconduct cases. The kind of place with an NDA at the front, desk and no phone policy in the lab. Personal or professional? He asked when I handed him the glass. Family, I said. That was all. 3 days later, he called. Julian, there were benzodiazepines in that drink. Not enough to kill someone, but enough to sedate a grown man for hours. Could cause confusion, loss of time, fatigue. Whoever poured that knew exactly what they were doing. I asked him to email me the full report. I didn't tell him what I was going to do with it. Truth was, I didn't know yet. That night I sat in my studio and stared at the report. Haley was in the kitchen, laughing softly as she FaceTimed her. Mom, completely unaware that the woman on the other end of the call had tried to drug her husband less than a week ago. I nearly walked in and told her everything. Nearly. But I stopped myself. Not because I doubted what I saw, not because I wanted to protect Diane. I hesitated because if I told Haley now, Diane would deny it. Gerald would back her. They'd say I was paranoid, unstable, and maybe Haley wouldn't believe them outright, but the doubt would take root. And that doubt would grow every time we argued, every time she got stressed, every time her parents made her feel like she had to pick sides. So I waited. Instead, I started digging. Diane had prescriptions from 3 different doctors, all for the same drug, Xanax. Her refill dates overlapped. I pulled records from online pharmacy reviews, whispered to a nurse friend about overlapping dosages. Everything. I found painted a picture of a woman juggling multiple medical profiles to keep her stash high and her tracks clean. And that wasn't all. I heard stories from their neighborhood, some vague, some not. A neighbor caught Diane rummaging through a bedroom during a dinner party. A tennis partner swore Diane borrowed a bracelet and never gave it back. At the country club, she'd been gently pushed out of a few events after slurring her words, one too many times, but none of it ever stuck. Because Gerald smoothed things over. Because they were rich, respected, and knew how to keep people quiet. But now I had proof, and I wasn't going to waste it. The opportunity came wrapped in fake politeness. Haley brought it up over breakfast the following Saturday. My mom says she needs some new headshots, she said, pouring coffee into my mug. For some new social media thing she's launching. She asked if you'd take them. She asked me. Yeah. She said she trusts you to make her look elegant but approachable. Haley laughed like it was absurd. I think she wants to rebrand herself. I nodded slowly. Sure. Tell her I'll come by next weekend. And just like that, Diane unknowingly scheduled her own reckoning. Showed up to their house alone, camera bag over my shoulder, a sealed manila envelope inside. She answered the door in a silk blouse perfectly made up. All smiles. Julian, you're so punctual, she beamed. Before we start, I said, stepping inside, I brought something. I think you should see. She looked confused for a moment, then cautious. I handed her the envelope. She opened it, pulling out the toxicology report first, then the overlapping prescription printouts. Her hands shook slightly, her lips parted. This is ridiculous. We both know it's not. I would never. Don't lie to me, I said, calm, firm. I saw you pour it. I switched the glasses. You tried to drug me, Diane. She set the papers down like they were burning her fingers. Why? I asked. Her face hardened. The mask slipped. Because you're not good enough for her, she snapped. You never were. I didn't speak. I let her keep digging. She needs structure. A man with a real job. Someone who doesn't spend half his life chasing sunsets and calling it work. So poisoning me was, what, a reality check? She looked away. It wasn't going to hurt you, just make you miss your event. Make her see you're unreliable. She would have come home. We could have talked sense into her. It was all so rehearsed, so matter-of-fact. I stepped back, picked up my camera bag. You're going to tell Gerald everything, I said. And from now on, you treat me with respect, not because you've changed, but because the alternative is me showing Haley exactly who you are. She scoffed. She'd never believe you. I walked to the door. Maybe not at first, but she'll believe the lab, and the prescriptions, and the neighbors. You really want to bet your relationship with your daughter on that? Her silence followed me all the way to my car. I didn't take a single photo. Diane stood in the entryway, speechless, the envelope still in her trembling hands. I walked past her without another word and let the door close behind me. I half expected her to call Haley that night, but she waited. 2 days later, Haley sat beside me on the couch, scrolling through her phone with a tight frown. My mom says the photo session didn't go well, she said quietly. I didn't respond. I knew what was coming. She said you were aggressive, that you yelled at her, that you threatened her. I turned to face her. Do you believe that? Haley's eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw the flicker of doubt she was trying so hard to hide. "I don't know what to believe," she whispered. "It's just, she seemed so upset." "She's upset because I found out what she did," I said. Then I stood, went to my studio, and came back with the envelope. "It's time you saw this." Haley sat frozen as she read the toxicology report, then the prescription printouts, then the timeline I'd sketched out on the back of an old invoice, how the events lined up, what I saw in the kitchen, what she drank, what Gerald drank. "I didn't want to show you this right away," I said. "I wanted to be sure. But she tried to drug me, Haley. That's not just controlling, that's criminal." Her hands were shaking by the time she reached the end. "My mom wouldn't do this," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "She did. You know it, somewhere deep down, you know." She didn't answer. She just stood, went into the bedroom and closed the door. That night, I lay awake in the guest room. The ceiling fan ticked quietly above me like a metronome. I didn't hear her cry, but I knew she was. The silence was heavier than any argument. The next few days felt like walking through molasses. Haley avoided me, not angrily, but cautiously, like I was a hot pan she didn't want to touch. She spent hours at her parents' house, came home late, didn't tell me what they talked about. When I asked how Gerald was doing, she just shrugged. Fine. I focused on work, stayed in the studio late, took on extra editing, anything to stay busy, anything to keep from staring at the front door, wondering if she'd walk in and tell me she was done. Then the texts started. One night, I opened my laptop and found 3 messages from Diane saved in an old backup folder. Not sent to me, but sent about me, to Haley. One said, "You need to ask yourself if you feel safe with him. Emotional instability can escalate." Another said, "He's manipulating you, isolating you. This is how abuse starts." The third was the worst. "I should have stopped this marriage before it started. You can still get out." I showed Haley. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she turned to me, her eyes bloodshot. "My father says this is all a misunderstanding," she said. "That you're trying to drive a wedge between us because you're insecure about your career." I laughed, bitter and short. "Of course he does." "What do you want me to do?" she asked. "Just cut them off? I want you to see them for who they really are," I said. "I want you to understand that this isn't new, this is a pattern. It's always been this way. You just didn't want to see it." She didn't answer, just went back to bed. For the next 2 weeks, we barely spoke. She was polite, even kind, but distant, like I was a co-worker she used to like, now just tolerated. I caught her crying once in the hallway. She didn't see me. Or maybe she did and just didn't care. Meanwhile, Diane and Gerald kept turning the screws, painting me as unbalanced, angry, unstable, twisting the truth into something they could control. And Haley, God, Haley, was right in the middle of it. I'd done everything. Right. I hadn't lashed out, I hadn't played dirty. I'd shown her the truth. And somehow I was still the villain in their story. That's when I realized something cold and brutal. The truth wasn't enough. Not for people like Diane and Gerald. They didn't need to win. They just needed to make me look like I lost. And right then, it was working. The package arrived on a Tuesday, no return address. No markings besides my name, handwritten in bold block letters across the front. Inside was a small USB drive and a sticky note in unfamiliar handwriting. "You should see this. V." It took me a second to place it. Vanessa Owen's wife. I hadn't spoken more than 10 sentences to her in the years we'd shared Sunday dinners. But there was a softness to her voice that always made me think she'd seen things and chosen silence, not ignorance. I plugged the drive into my laptop and opened the first file. Home security footage. Time-stamped from the night of Diane's birthday dinner. Multiple angles, one camera pointed at the kitchen. There she was, Diane, perfectly dressed, standing at the counter, lifting a small vial and tilting it into a glass. She glanced over her shoulder just once, then she quickly wiped the vial and tucked it into a drawer. Another file showed me walking in, taking the glasses. Gerald drinking. But it didn't stop there. Another video, time-stamped 2 hours after. We'd left. Showed Diane pacing the living room, red-faced and wild-eyed. Gerald shouted from off-camera. Then he stormed into frame. "You poisoned the wrong glass," he barked. "Jesus, Diane." Diane threw her hands up. "He wasn't supposed to switch it. I told you we needed to make Haley see how unstable he—" This isn't the first time you've done something like this," Gerald snapped. Silence, then him again, quieter. "You need help." Diane's voice turned cold. "No, what I need is for our daughter to come home before she gets pregnant by a man with no future." I closed the laptop. My hands were shaking. It wasn't just about me. It never had been. Called Vanessa immediately. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. There was a long pause, then. "Because they did the same thing to me." She told me everything. When she and Owen started dating, Diane didn't speak to her for 6 months. Gerald constantly made jokes about her career in interior design, calling it furniture arranging in front of guests. There were accusations of cheating, rumors Diane started herself. Vanessa nearly left Owen twice, convinced she was the problem. "I thought I was losing my mind," she said. "Then I got pregnant with James, and suddenly Diane was warm and welcoming. I realized later it wasn't love. It was leverage. A grandchild meant control." "Why didn't you tell us?" I asked. "Owen doesn't know," she admitted. "He worships his father, thinks everything Gerald does is out of love. I tried to tell him once. He said I was paranoid." That night, I sat in the dark and stared at the wall for a long time. Then I opened a new folder on my computer and started collecting everything: emails, texts, recordings, video clips. I made a spreadsheet of everyone Haley had been close to in the last decade. One by one, I reached out to them. Some didn't respond. Some did. An old boyfriend, Adam, said Diane had told him Haley wasn't serious about their relationship, that she was trying to let him down gently, and asked him to give her space. He believed her. He ghosted Haley. The breakup blindsided her. A former college friend said she was told by Gerald that Haley was in a fragile mental state and needed distance from toxic influences. That friend stopped returning calls after that. Then I reached out to Thomas. I expected him to hang up on me. Instead, he listened, quietly, carefully. "She loved me," he said finally, "and I loved her. But her parents, it was like living under surveillance. They planted fake texts, set up a dinner I didn't show up to because I never knew about it, made it look like I was cheating." "You tried to tell her?" "I did," he said. "But by then she didn't trust me. Her mom told her I was manipulating her to cover my guilt." He sent me the emails, screenshots, call logs, everything. I compiled it all. Meanwhile, Haley still came home from her parents' house with red eyes and silence. I didn't push. Not yet. Then Vanessa sent me another video. Diane and Gerald sitting in their den, sipping wine like they were discussing the weather. Once they divorce, Gerald said, "We'll convince her to move back home. She can run the foundation. Meet someone suitable." This whole thing was just a detour. I watched it twice. Then I copied the files to 3 different backups, because this wasn't just gaslighting anymore. This was calculated, patterned, systemic. They weren't just trying to control Haley's life. They already had. And the only reason I was still standing was because I hadn't given them the chance to finish the job. But I was done reacting. It was time to make them watch everything they'd tried to bury come to light. I didn't tell Haley why I wanted Owen and Vanessa over for dinner. I just said it was important. "Please," I told her. "No parents, just us." She hesitated but agreed. That night, I made something simple. Roasted chicken, garlic potatoes, salad. Haley helped in the kitchen but said little. Owen arrived in a blazer. Vanessa wore no makeup, eyes shadowed like she hadn't slept. The 4 of us sat around the table making small talk that felt like a funeral eulogy. After dinner, I stood and walked to the TV. "There's something you both need to see," I said. Haley tensed. "Julian, I'm not doing this to humiliate anyone. I'm doing this because we can't keep pretending this is normal. I connected my laptop and opened the first video file, Diane in the kitchen, pouring liquid into a glass. Haley sat up straight. Vanessa folded her hands tight in her lap. The next video, me entering the kitchen, taking both glasses, Gerald drinking, Diane watching, expression tight, then the argument. You poisoned the wrong glass. This isn't the first time. I heard Owen suck in a breath. He muttered something under it. Haley was pale. Vanessa sat motionless. Then came the next video, Gerald and Diane in the den, casually plotting their next move. Once they divorce, we'll convince her to move back home, meet someone suitable. When the last video ended, I paused it on Diane's face. I have more, I said. Emails, messages, interviews. You want it? It's all here. Haley turned to me slowly. Her eyes were wet, but her face was calm. Why didn't you show me this sooner? I took a deep breath. Because if I had, you wouldn't have believed me. You would have said I was paranoid, or angry, or trying to break you away from them. She didn't deny it. I needed you to see all of it. Not just what they did to me, but what they've done to you, your whole life. She covered her mouth with one hand. Her shoulders started to shake. Owen stood up. That's not my parents, he said. That's not who they are. Owen, Vanessa started. No, he said louder. You think you can just splice together clips and turn our family into villains? You think you're some kind of hero here? Sit down, I said evenly. Watch the rest or walk out, but don't pretend they haven't done this before. He looked at Vanessa, waiting for her to back him, but she didn't. You know what they did to me, she said softly. You just didn't want to see it. Owen stared at her like he didn't recognize the woman in front of him. Then he sat, back down, quietly. Finally, Haley leaned forward. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything, I told her. You just have to decide what happens next. There was silence. Then she whispered. They tried to destroy everything, and they did it with smiles on their faces. She turned to her brother. They lied to us, Owen, for years. Owen shook his head slowly. No, they were trying to protect us. By controlling us, she said. He blinked, then buried, his face in his hands. Vanessa reached for his shoulder, but he didn't move. Later that night, after they'd left, Haley and I sat on the edge of our bed in silence. The air between us wasn't cold anymore, just heavy. I need time to process this, she said finally. But I believe you, and I'm sorry I doubted you. I nodded. I never blamed you. I blamed them. The next morning, Diane called. Haley put her on speaker. Darling, Diane said, cheerful and sugary. I was thinking maybe you should come stay with us for a few days, just to clear your head. Silence. Marriage can be overwhelming. Diane continued. A little space might help you both. Haley's eyes met mine. Mom, she said flatly. I've seen the videos. A beat of dead air. What videos? The security footage. The conversation you had with Dad. The plan to break up my marriage. Whatever Julian showed you, he's manipulated it. He's always been jealous of our family. Stop. Haley's voice was steel now. We're coming over tonight, she said. Me, Julian, Owen, Vanessa. We're going to talk about this, like a family. Diane's voice cracked on the other end. Sweetheart, no more lies, Haley said. Then she hung up. She turned to me. They're going to deny everything. They'll spin it around on you. I nodded. I know. So what's our plan? I looked at her for a long time. For years they told me I didn't belong in this family, I said. Tomorrow they're going to find out just how wrong they were. We arrived at the Renner house just after 6. Owen and Vanessa were already seated stiffly in the living room. Gerald was sipping whiskey. Diane was setting out a tray of cheese like this was a normal family get-together, not a reckoning. I understand there's been a misunderstanding, Gerald began smoothly. We're happy to clear things up. No misunderstanding, said. I set my tripod down and clicked the camera on. I'm documenting this conversation for the family archives. Diane flinched. This is private family business. Exactly, I said, and I'm family. We sat for the next 2 hours. I laid it out, one video at a time, the drink, the argument, the manipulation, the tapes, the emails, the testimonies. I didn't embellish, I didn't lecture. I just pressed play and let the evidence speak for itself. At first, Diane and Gerald denied everything. That's not what it looks like. That clip is out of context. Julian's twisting this to create drama. But as clip after clip played, their defenses weakened. Diane grew pale. Gerald stopped drinking. By the time I played the video of their once she divorces plan, even Owen couldn't look at them. Finally, Haley stood. I love you both, she said, voice shaking. But what you've done is unforgivable. You don't get to control my life anymore. Gerald opened his mouth. No, Owen said, standing beside his sister. She's right. We're done. You don't get to manipulate us, or our marriages, or our futures. Diane started crying, not remorse, panic. Gerald looked stunned, as if he couldn't comprehend that his children were defying him. As we prepared to leave, I handed Gerald a USB drive. This contains everything, I said. The footage, the emails, the recordings. It's yours. What's that supposed to mean? He asked, narrowing his eyes. It means I'm not going to destroy your reputation. That would hurt Haley. I would never do that. I paused. But if you ever interfere again, if you try to sabotage us or poison her against me, copies will go to every member of your country club, your business partners, your charity board. For the first time since I met him, Gerald looked at me with something like respect. I underestimated you, he said. Yes, I replied. You did. 6 months passed. Haley and Owen started therapy. Vanessa came with him. Diane and Gerald kept their distance. They sent occasional texts. Haley responded when she felt like it. Boundaries were finally in place. Then came the holidays. They invited us all to dinner, said it was a fresh start. Haley wanted to go. They're still my parents, she said, and they're trying. I agreed. But I wasn't naive. Dinner was calm, awkward but civil. Diane asked about my gallery. Gerald complimented the roast. No one mentioned the past. Afterward, Gerald asked me into his study. I have a proposition, he said, pouring 2 glasses of scotch. I didn't touch mine. I've been thinking about your career, he said. Photography's been good to you, but have you considered diversifying? He offered me a position, junior partner track, salary, benefits, the whole pitch. Why would you do that? I asked. Your family, he said smoothly. And I respect how you handled the unpleasantness. You protected my daughter. That's what a real man does. I set the glass down. I appreciate the offer, I said, but no. His smile faded. Be reasonable, he said. This is an olive branch. No, I said again. It's another attempt at control, and I'm done playing that game. He leaned in, voice low. Everyone has a price, Julian. I stood. That's where you're wrong, and that's why you'll never understand your daughter. When I returned to the living room, Diane was showing Haley an old photo album. You were so happy when you lived at home, she said. Haley looked over at me. I gave her the faintest nod. She stood. Mom, Dad, she said clearly. We have something to tell you. They turned, curious, guarded. We're having a baby, she said, 3 months along. Shock. Then Diane burst into tears and embraced her. Gerald approached more slowly. Congratulations, he said stiffly. Thank you, I said. Then I lowered my voice so only he could hear. This child will never be a pawn in your games. I promise you that. His face hardened. Then, reluctantly, he nodded. 3 weeks later, a certified letter arrived. From Gerald's attorney. Inside was a deed to our house, paid in full, and legal paperwork for a trust fund in our unborn child's name. No conditions, no clauses, just clean, irrevocable transfer. It wasn't an apology. Gerald wasn't capable of that. It was acknowledgement. Our daughter Eliza was born in July. When Diane and Gerald came to the hospital, they brought gifts, took photos, held her briefly, then left without offering parenting advice. Months passed. They didn't interfere. They stayed quiet, respectful. Haley called it a truce. I called it survival. That winter, Gerald mailed me a glossy brochure, his company's annual report. My photographs were featured throughout. Landscapes, portraits, architecture, all work I'd done on my own terms. Tucked inside was a short note. Hired the best photographer I know. Thought you'd want a copy. It wasn't forgiveness, it was something else. Respect, maybe, or surrender. I didn't call to thank him. We both understood. This wasn't about gratitude. It was about boundaries. That spring, I opened my first solo gallery downtown. Haley stood beside me, Eliza on her hip. My parents flew in, clients came, friends brought flowers. Diane and Gerald showed up late, stayed briefly. Diane held Eliza under Haley's eye. Gerald shook my hand, looked at the photographs, said nothing, about what I should be doing differently. As they left, Diane whispered, "You've built something beautiful." "I know," I said. Later that night, Haley and I sat on the porch watching the stars come out. Eliza slept upstairs. "Do you think they've changed?" she asked. I thought about it. "No," I said finally. "But they've accepted they can't change us?" She leaned against me. "Sometimes that's enough." And it was, because I hadn't won by fighting their way. I'd won by refusing to play.